Alright, so being quick in F1 2020 in general is difficult. Being quick in the wet is something different altogether. That's what we're going to look into in this video. So give it a thumbs up if you enjoy it. Sub up to the channel if you want to see more stuff like this. But without further ado, let's get into the video. So like in the dry conditions, TT to online mode feels different. There are differences. I don't know what the differences are. It's the physics. Whatever it is, it's different. And it's the same for the wet as well. So you've got to be aware of that. So don't be surprised when you take a world record wet lap setup, take it online, and it feels like absolute. So just be aware of that and you'll be fine. Now, if we compare the wet physics to real life momentarily, they're nowhere near, to be honest. And that is the same for every racing game and sim. The developers clearly understand that there's less grip in the wet, hence why the lap times are slower, but that is where the similarities end. So the dry line is still the best line to use. It's not any less grippy than the traditional wet line that they use in real life. So as long as you stick to the line you use in the dry, you'll be fine. So simple, really. One thing that is quite realistic is the fact that the curbs that are coated in paint get a lot slippier when wet compared with the dry. So for the majority of the time in the wet conditions, you'd ideally stay off the curbs. Not 100% of the time though. Some curbs on some tracks are still okay to use and will allow you to be a bit quicker. So it's kind of up to you to discover which curbs you can and can't take. Whereas in the dry, you're pretty much abusing every single curb you can. The optimum tyre temperature, if we're talking about the internal core, otherwise known as the carcass, is 100 degrees. Hence why in time trial is this temperature. In the wet, it's 70 degrees. So this is quite handy to know, as it means you won't want to get above this in online mode. So in quali, for example, before you start a quali lap, it's very important to have tyre temps in mind. So when you get to the end of the lap, they're not overheating. Especially the rear tyres, is because the cars are rear wheel drive and you put all the power down on those rear tyres. In other words, just take it fairly easy on the outlap and keep an eye on those core tyre temps. If you want a little tutorial on how the tyres work on the F1 games, then check out the video in the card above. A rough delta between the lap times in the wet compared with the dry in this game, if we're talking about esports level pace in both scenarios, the wet is probably about 15% slower than the dry. Hence why, example, at Brazil you can do a high 105 in qualifying in the dry. In the wet, a high 15 is possible. So it's just a rough reference for you to use in terms of what times to aim for. Just go 15% slower than the dry times and you should be in a pretty good place. Now there is a certain driving technique you need to use in F1 2020 in the wet to be fast. I understand everyone's going to do things slightly differently, but there are some core fundamentals you need to do to get the most from the car. So generally speaking, every input needs to be slowed down and reined in a bit in the wet because there is less grip. Accelerating, braking, steering, shifting, literally everything needs to be slowed down, and that's because it's far easier to go past the point of no return when it comes to the grip levels. Let's start with throttle control. Driving in the wet for a number of hours will improve your throttle control in the dry, so it makes you more in tune and sensitive with it. This is where the majority of the lap time can be found in the wet, accelerating out of slow to medium speed corners because it's so hard to do. Putting down 1,000 plus horsepower when it's wet is hard, there's no two ways about it, and the best way to do it is being progressive with the throttle, making sure the car is as straight as possible when accelerating, and going through the gears at a certain rate whilst modulating the throttle. And at the same time as all of this, feeling the grip levels and adjusting all of the things I've just mentioned throughout the exit of the corner accordingly. Using the throttle to rotate the car in the middle of the corner to generate some rotation is something I talk about quite a lot in the dry. You should still use this trick in the wet because it is quicker. You should have to be a lot more careful and sensitive with it because it's so much easier to break traction. What I would say in terms of equipment, since I've had my Heisenberg sprint pedals compared with the old Fanatec CSO Elite pedals, I found throttle control to be a bit easier. So I think it's because the Heisenberg pedals have a heavier spring resistance, like in a real car, whereas with the weaker Fanatec pedal, it's definitely harder to be consistent in my opinion. Not impossible, you can be just as quick on the Fanatec as you can on the Heisenberg, it's just an observation I've made. So in terms of throttle control, that is the best way I can explain it. Hopefully the video footage helps as well. It's worth saying though that F1 2020 out of all the games I play is the hardest game to feel the road underneath you, which is why a lot of people when they first play it they say it's floaty, a bit numb, has a strange feeling. Because of this, there's quite a lot of guesswork needed when you first start playing it, but once you put in the hours, and a lot of hours, you'll be hypersensitive to the feeling of the game and you'll be able to be more consistent. Braking is similar to driving in the dry, but just toning it down a bit. In most corners you want to be braking a bit earlier, hitting 100% stopping power on the initial press of the brake, then bleeding off earlier than you would in the dry. Otherwise, because there's less grip, you'll lock the front tyres. The way then in which you can slow the car down quickly because you can't brake as much is by downshifting and using the engine braking more. We'll talk about this more shortly, but in medium to high speed corners though, that would be flat out or just a slight lift of the throttle in the dry, they may be quite tricky in the wet. So to help get the car to turn in, using a dab of the brake along with the steering can help generate some of that turn in. which I find this really helpful. In terms of shifting, 11,800 RPM is still your target upshift value to get the most from the engine, but only when you have the grip. In the wet, as we already talked about briefly, you want to short shift a lot more, just to make sure you can keep accelerating fairly quickly without spinning. For downshifting though, engine braking is key as we mentioned earlier, but going down the lower gears too quickly will lock the wheels. So for example, be a little bit more patient when downshifting from say 4th to 2nd compared with 8th to 6th. Using the downshifts to generate some rotation like in previous F1 games can still work in certain corners where it's easy to pick up understeer. So turn 8 at Brazil for example is a good place to use it. I wouldn't make this your main way of driving the car, but you can use it in certain scenarios. Now with the steering, again, just be a bit smoother with the way you initially turn in, because if you turn in too aggressively like you would in the dry, you'll go past the point of grip and just pick up a heap load of understeer. So I've actually changed my wheel rotation from 360 degrees to 320 degrees on the F1 game recently in both dry and wet conditions, and I'd say it's helped a little bit, so it might be worth you guys giving it a go. It's worth saying that the quickest drivers use all of the controls at the same time to drive the car in one fluid motion. This needs to be done even more so in the wet as there's less grip, so this is why in the wet the best drivers stand out more. Very important though to try and feel the grip as much as possible, so turning up your FFB or your force feedback a small amount in the wet can help with this if you're really struggling. So it may sound really easy to jump from wet to dry or dry to wet, whatever way you want to go around. But if you want to qualify near the front, it's not easy. I personally think it's easier to go from dry to wet conditions instead of going the other way round, because it's easier to drive at a slower pace compared with what you're used to. In other words, if grip gets taken away from you, it's easier to adapt to the limit of the car compared with a situation where you're being given extra grip. So, example, going from wet to dry conditions, this is very difficult. What I'd recommend is do the wet/intermediate practice first, get out of the way, because it'll take you a little while to get back to the limit in the dry. On the day of the race, I'd do maximum 1 or 2 laps practice, just so if the actual session is wet, you're warm, you're ready, but your main concern is to be on the limit, on the pace in the dry. So, little top tip, I'd recommend doing some wet practice, but with your dry setup in the wet or your wet setup in the dry, both maybe, because most leagues are dynamic weather, means it can rain at any point, and you need to be ready for whatever happens. So just from a comfort standpoint, I'd do practice in all scenarios. So, setups. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video, because I'm thinking I might make a separate video for it, if there's the demand for it. So if you want to see a wet setups video, then please let me know in the comments down below. But the gist of this is, the best setups in the wet are a lot different to the best ones in the dry, and the best intermediate setups are a little bit different to the best ones in the wet. It's important you have a good setup underneath you in the wet, to be quick, of course, but to also help you keep it on the road without firing it off into the barrier. So, as I say, we'll look at this topic properly in a different video. Now, it is worth saying, one of my biggest strengths on this game is driving in the wet. I don't really know why, because I don't practice the wet more than the dry, but just one of those weird things really, I suppose. So I've tried to portray everything I think when I drive in the wet into this video. I hope it makes sense, I hope it helps. Maybe you find some lap time from it, that'd be great. And to those that have made it obviously this far in this video without clicking off, that's proper dedication. So don't worry, you will get better. Hard work always pays off. But from me on this video, that is the end. And until the next video, I'll see you soon.